Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're going to talk about the differences between Spanish and Italian. In fact, I'd like to share with you my own experience as a native speaker of Italian and how it is for me to hear Spanish, because I haven't been trained in Spanish. I have never really studied Spanish. So what this means is that I can give you a 100% honest and accurate feeling of what it means for an Italian to hear Spanish and how much I can understand. Now, normally what I notice is that three things can happen. First thing, which is my favorite, of course, you hear Spanish, of course you realize immediately that it's another language, but you understand everything. And it's an amazing feeling, and I'll get more into this. It's really strange. Secondly, a few words you understand, but other words you don't, but you can still sort of make out the meaning of what it's being said. But the third thing that can happen between Italian and Spanish is that you hear a word, you recognize it, you think you understand, but you ultimately don't, because it's actually a false friend, and there are quite a lot. So starting from the first experience, it is very, very strange, bizarre, puzzling to say the least, because again, there are a lot of Italians who have never studied Spanish, and yet our languages are somewhat similar, and I'd like to say very similar. In fact, I think that Spanish, among Romance languages, I think that Spanish and Italian are the closest. Of course, there is common ground between Italian and French, and there is common ground between I don't know, Spanish and Portuguese, Italian and Portuguese. There is always common ground, but Italian and Spanish seem to be the closest. But first of all, if we consider, for example, the pronunciation, well, if we look up the R, well, both Italians and Spanish, and I believe Portuguese, roll the R. So we all pronounce it like R. Whereas the French, of course, they don't. They have the R sound, which is, I believe, Germanic in origin, which explains why the other Romance languages don't have this sound in their repertoire of sounds. But another interesting thing is, but it's more of a situation of vocabulary that makes Spanish and Italian rather similar. For example, let me give you some examples. What happened to me the other day is I was chatting with a friend of mine, and he is Spanish speaking, okay? And of course I'm Italian speaking. What language do we use when we chat on Facebook? English. Hooray for the imperialists. The reason why we use English is because he can't write Italian and I can't write Spanish. When we have to come up with a word, we don't know the equivalent in the other language. But if we hear it, we can recognize it. So how is that possible? Well, what happened is that as I said, we normally chat in English, but what happened is that he has got a friend, and this friend doesn't speak English, so he said, this friend of mine has got a few questions for you about martial arts, and he would like to ask you, but he's going to tell me, he's going to send me a message in Spanish, and then I'm going to translate for you. And I'm like, okay, sure, yeah, I'm more than happy to answer his questions. And then he first sent me the whole message in Spanish, and then he was starting to translate it. He actually said that he hates translating. His name is Jorge, by the way, and Jorge, muchas gracias. Thank you for your help. Because he actually inspired me, and he told me, make this video, it's a good idea. And I said yes, because Jorge and I were actually discussing about this. We were talking about how it's strange and bizarre that the fact that we can both understand each other when we use each other's language. So he wrote this message in Spanish, and then he started translating, and I told him, Jorge, don't translate, you don't actually need to, because I've read the message and I can understand everything. All the message, I read it and I could just understand it. So he was like, oh yeah, cool. So I answered to him, and then he sent me an actual vocal message in Spanish. I listened to it and I could understand 100% perfect accuracy. And it was amazing, because the feeling you get is like, hold on a minute, I'm listening to a foreign tongue, on a foreign language, but I know what he's saying, I know what he means. The reason why, and of course we tried the other way around. I sent him a message in Italian, and he could pick up, I would say 70% of what I said, maybe 80%, but he did miss some. And this is interesting though, because I've literally repeated the same thing he told me. So from this, actually, it sort of strengthened a theory that I already had, that we will talk about towards later on in this video. And it's the idea of that I think Italians have a slight advantage in understanding Spanish when they are not trained than Spanish have when they try to understand Italian if they have received no training. And I'll tell you why. The reason why we understand each other, or the reason why I understood his message in Spanish, is because a lot of words are very similar. But it's not just a matter of the words being similar. And I'll give you some examples. Is that there are some words in Spanish, and this actually gives the advantage to the Italian, I think. There are some words in Spanish that sound like old-fashioned words in Italian. Let me give you some examples. For example, to understand, in Italian we say capire. And then when you conjugate it and you say I understand or I see, you would say capisco. Now, every time that I've tried saying this to a Spanish-speaking person who doesn't know Italian, they don't know what I'm saying. What they use instead, both these verbs exist in Italian. They become comprendo and intendo. So I understand the words, even if the accent is different and it's slightly, sort of hyphenated, like there's a part cut off, I can still recognize it. But the thing is that comprendere, we basically never use it in Italian. Like, I don't think I've ever said in my life, ti comprendo, ti comprendo. You can, it's absolutely fine, it's there. Maybe you hear it in films. But in real life, I would say that a very low percentage of people use it, and perhaps only those people who simply like that expression. But the majority of Italians will say ti capisco. Also, for intendere, we can say intendo, but we don't use it as understanding. We use it as meaning. So you can say, in English, when you say I mean, and then you explain yourself, and in Italian you can say voglio dire, which means I want to say, or intendo dire, which means, again, I mean to say, I mean. That's the way we use it, but when you say in Spanish, I understand what you're saying because the root is similar. So within that context, I can understand it. And that's the same for comprender. There are a lot of words like this. For example, I think in South American Spanish, because of course there is South American Spanish and Spain Spanish, and they are different. But in South American Spanish, to say car, but you can say auto, and we've got auto in Italian as well, but you can also say carro, el carro. Now, if you say the word carro in Italian, and I suppose in Spain Spanish as well, it means like an old wagon or a cart carried by horses, or oxen. This is what it means. In modern day Italian, when you say a car, as I said, you either say auto, automobile, or you can say macchina. That's what we say. I think in Spain they say el coche. Not 100% sure, but that I wouldn't understand because there is nothing close to it in Italian. Now, the verbs, for example, the verb to eat, to speak, is hablar in Spanish, parlare in Italian. Still recognizable. Also because, even if there is no P, because I say parlare and they say hablar with the H that is not pronounced in Spanish, and it's not pronounced in Italian either, I can still make out the meaning, because if you say yo hablo español, and then I think io parlo italiano, io parlo spagnolo, io hablo español, io parlo spagnolo, I can perfectly recognize it. Although Italian is closer to French with this word, because in French you say parle, parler, so je parle français, je parle italien. But we can still understand each other. But let me tell you, it's still easier to understand Spanish for an Italian than it is to understand French. I understand more French than Spanish, but that's because I have studied French. I have never studied Spanish, but I could still understand lots of things from, for example, a fight in Italian is combattimento. They say el combate. Combate. It's very similar. It's a combat, right? So this is why sometimes it happens that if the words sound very similar, conversazione, conversación, grazie, gracias, per favore, por favor, I can perfectly understand it. But other times what happens is that they have words that we don't have, or it's just, and vice versa. So for example, to eat is comer, we say mangiare, again closer to French, manger. And food for them is comida. Now, I know it because I've looked it up, but if someone told me just comida, and I hadn't looked it up before in the dictionary, I wouldn't have a clue what he's talking about, unless he's mimicking a little bit, or perhaps, he's in front of food, and maybe I can kind of understand, but that has nothing to do with food, with the language, with my native tongue. For food in Italian, in wrong Italian, some people do call it il mangiare, but it's like dialect. You don't say that in standard. It's just in some dialects in the south. So normally you say cibo, il cibo. So again, a word that I suppose Spanish wouldn't understand. But sometimes you've got words that are tricky, they are false friends. For example, we have just said that some words are just similar. Amigo, amico in Italian. It's just C, G, G for Spanish, C for Italian. But other words like carta. Now, carta in Spanish is letter, but in Italian it means paper, which I think they say papiel, or I think they say like that. So if someone spoke to me in Spanish and I didn't know this, and I was just, a native speaker of Italian, and he told me something about la carta, I wouldn't understand the letter, I would understand the paper, okay? Which is, of course, similar, but, if you told me I sent you a letter, I would think that you sent me some paper, right? And the funny thing is that I would think that I understood. I'd be like, carta, sì. But instead, I am misunderstanding you. There are others. For example, a really funny one is the word for donkey, because in Spanish it's burro, although I think they also have asno, but burro is a famous one. Now, burro in Italian means butter. So this is the funniest one in the planet. Because if you tell me, for example, can you bring me the burro, and I will bring you butter, and maybe you wanted me to bring your donkey, I don't know, if we are in the countryside. So again, an Italian would be like, sì, okay, burro, va bene, go, va bien, go, and then I bring, something completely different. So there are quite a few like this. Let's see if I can come up with others. Here's a good one. Okay, oil and vinegar. Now, oil in Italian is olio, so it's closer to English, but in Spanish is aceite. What's interesting is that if you say aceite in Spanish to an Italian, I will think of vinegar. Why? Because in Italian vinegar is aceto. So vice versa, if I say buono l'aceto, so vinegar is good, isn't it, sort of, a Spanish might think that I'm talking about oil, but I'm not. I'm talking about vinegar, because vinegar in Spanish is vinagre, so closer to both French and English. So, for example, if a Spanish says el burro es mi animal favorito, okay, so the donkey is my favorite animal. If an Italian hears that, first of all, he's going to freak out, because like burro is not an animal if he doesn't know Spanish. But also, in Italian, we can say, this is how we would say it in Italian, l'asino è il mio animale preferito. So, if you notice here, it's a matter of choice of words. So, 99% of Italian, maybe 100% of Italians will use the word preferito. Do we have the word favorito? Yes, absolutely, we have it. We just don't use it. Spanish people, most of them, I think they would use favorito, but they do have the word preferito. Maybe it's a bit more formal for them, I don't know, I think it depends on the area. But I have always heard them use the word favorito. And also, when they say that they like something, they use the verb me gusta, they say gustar, right? Me gusta. Now, me gusta bailar, for example, I like dancing. We would say in Italian, mi piace ballare, and I don't think Spanish people can understand piace, piacere, if they don't know Italian. But we Italians can understand gustar, because we normally use it when we want to taste food. So gustare something in Italian means to taste something, and it's normally linked to a positive meaning because of positive pleasure taken from food. So it is sort of linked to pleasure as well. So if you say me gusta bailar, I immediately understand you mean you like dancing, although I would never use gustare with dancing in Italian, but still I understand, and it sounds very Spanish to me. Now, talking about the differences though, a difference between Spanish and Italian is definitely the way we organize plural and singular, because we both have masculine and feminine, but plural and singular, and sometimes they are not the same, but just like in French as well. I mean, in French, it's funny actually, because you know how masculine and feminine works in Romance languages. It's not just that we use masculine and feminine when we talk about men and women, but also when we talk about objects. So for us, for example, for me, a chair is a lady, basically, and a table is a boy. That's how it works. And of course, the grammar changes accordingly. And maybe I will make a dedicated video onto this and trying to help you understand from the head of someone who's been brought up with this concept of masculine and feminine, how that actually feels, because it does give a feeling. If you're interested, I'll make a video but specifically about this. But it's funny because sometimes, for example, the sea in Italian is masculine, so it's male, sort of. So you say il mare, because il is the article for masculine singular in Italian. Now, in French, for example, it becomes la mer, so it's female in French. The sea is female. And again, a similar situation happens with flower. In Italian, flower is masculine, il fiore. In French, it's feminine, la fleur. So as you can see, in Romance languages, sometimes we change, like concepts and objects change from masculine to feminine and from feminine to masculine. It becomes a bit complex. In Italian, we don't have neutral, and I don't think there is neutral in French and in Spanish either. I believe neutral is present in German, if I'm not wrong, but again, I've never studied German. With plural and singular, what happens is that while Spanish is closer to English because they add the S, so for example, you've got amigo, amigos, right? In Italian, you don't. So in Italian, you have to actually change the vowel at the end, and that becomes a bit complex because singular masculine is normally o, sometimes e. Singular feminine is always a. Plural masculine finishes with i, and plural feminine finishes with e. And I've used Italian pronunciation of the vowels. This is what, in order not to confound it, to make it confusing, I actually had them appear. So for plural and singular, for foreigners, it's problematic. For Italians, it's automatic. It's like super simple. We don't even have to think about it. But I think even for foreign people, it becomes difficult when you're still linked to the book. You're studying the language and you don't actually use it. But when you start using it, you will get a feel for it. A word will sound right. When you have to use plural or feminine and singular and everything, it just becomes automatic because it's a pattern and it repeats itself. Sometimes there are very strange exceptions, but most of the times it does fit within some categories that you can memorize and your mind will follow. So again, as I said, it's an amazing experience when you do understand the language, a language you haven't studied, and it's strange because sometimes I'm trying to watch a film in Spanish and I understand, and then the conversation shifts to perhaps a topic where the words are too different, but different between Italian and Spanish, and then I just stop understanding and I just understand zero, or maybe like 20%, 30%. I can pick up some things, but I don't actually understand. So, but I would say that, yeah, Spanish, it's definitely a lot easier to learn for an Italian than it is for a German or for an American, and I would say that so is Italian for a Spanish, although I do believe that Spanish people do have a slightly more difficult time than Italians picking up our language also, because grammatically speaking, as I could prove to you, our language is a bit more difficult, although in terms of conjugating verbs we are quite similar, because let me give you an example. To conjugate the verb to speak in the present form in Italian we say io parlo, tu parli, egli parla, noi parliamo, voi parlate, essi parlano. In Spanish it becomes yo hablo, tú hablas, él habla. Nosotros hablamos, vosotros habláis, ellos hablan. In French, for example, it becomes je parle, tu parles, il parle. Nous parlons, vous parlez, il parle. Fun fact, in Sicilian actually, Sicilian dialect, the conjugation of some persons is closer to Spanish than it is to Italian. Because, for example, Spanish, as we said, they say vosotros, nosotros. So literally, us, we others, you others. And that's what happens in Sicilian as well, because in Sicilian we say nu altri, vo altri, which means us others, you others. So it's like a literal translation from Spanish, and that's because of the dominations, of course, a literal translation from Spanish within the Sicilian terminology. Of course, overall Sicilian is closer to Italian than it is to Spanish, but there are quite a lot of words coming from Spanish and some words from French. For example, the word to work in Italian is lavorare, in Spanish trabajar, in French travailler, in Sicilian travagliare. Alright then, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. Let me know if there are other languages you would like me to talk about in the comments below, and I will see you tomorrow for my next daily upload. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Y recuerden, Metatron ha expandido sus alas. E rimembrate, Metatron ha spiegato le ali. Goodbye. Nos vemos. Ciao. Hola, mi nombre es Inigo Montoya. Tú has matado a mi padre. Prepárate a morir.